All right. Thank you guys and welcome. And thanks so much for joining us for our third Louisiana Tapestry Table. This is a series that's produced by New News Arts and Culture Collective and sponsored by the Louisiana Endowment for Humanities Rebirth Grant. So thanks everyone for joining. I want to introduce the team that makes this all happen. First, we have Peg Raymer and George Marks keeping New News together. So thank you, guys, so much for your time. Woo! On the production side, we have David Morrow, the project manager and videographer extraordinaire. We have Charles Sasson with graphic design and vibes. Nikki coming in with hospitality and the stats. Appreciate it. My name is Haley, and I'm working with the guests for doing it today. Thank you so much for joining. If you liked this table, I would like for you also to consider we have another one happening in March, and we have another one happening in February. So this is a monthly series. So please stay in tune. You'll notice there's some weird cubes. These are what we do in lieu of PowerPoint. So feel free to take a look and toggle those around. Elena's going to be talking about some of the images on it, and they have some more stuff around it. So it's helpful. So the point of Louisiana Tapestries is thinking about and discussing Louisiana cultures that are maybe under the surface. When we came up with the idea of tapestries, we came up with the concept is coming from the metaphor of this idea of what is a tapestry. And it's something that's being built. It's usually still on a loom, and it's fragile, and it's something that takes a lot to keep together. And I think that that's a really great metaphor of how we talk about Louisiana and who we are and what makes us the strength of our fabric. Another thing about tapestries is that it portrays images of things more than patterns. So we're trying to portray one person's life or one person's image of Louisiana. So we hope you can join us for this conversation. I'm going to introduce Helena, or have Helena introduce herself. Today's topic is German immigration, contemporary German immigration today. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Spoon.
My name is Helena Maschke. I am a reporter with the Acadia Advocate and the Flirt, which is a nonprofit newsletter in Lafayette. I cover healthcare, birth education, and prior to that, I lived in Lake Charles. So, we're gonna, I think, talk a little bit more about, place and space in Louisiana. So I'm going to leave a little bit of that for later. But, on the cubes, you're going to see some pictures of, the place in Germany where I'm from, which is an island in the Baltic Sea called Thun, and some images of Canada, Taylor Carriage. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, I think. But, yes, I came here from Lake Charles and have been in, Lafayette for a year and a half now. It doesn't feel that long, but, do you want to kind of start with that?
So how'd you get here?
So, there have been a few stops along the way. I was an exchange student in Los Angeles in 2014 and, went to UCLA there, really loved it, and decided that if I were to continue, like, my higher education journey, I wanted to do it at a school in the U.S. I knew I wanted to do journalism, and unfortunately, at UCLA does not have a journalism school. So, I ended up applying at Columbia in New York and couldn't believe that I got it. I got a scholarship that made it possible to attend. And then after that, I moved around the country a little bit. I went to Florida, did sort of my first, journalism, had my first journalism job there, and then moved back to California, lived there for a few years, and working through the pandemic as a reporter was really challenging. I wasn't a health reporter at the time. I was a business reporter, but everyone was a health reporter at that time. It was just nonstop. And so I felt a little bit burned out, I think, and needed some time to decide if I wanted to stay in journalism, if I wanted to do something else. And so I ended up living in Mexico for 6 months. And lived there trying to figure my life out. And eventually decided that yes, I wanted to stay in journalism. But I didn't want to go back to council. Felt like time for a new step for me. And I just decided that I would apply to any job that sounded interesting, regardless of where it was. So I think I applied for a job reporting on fisheries in Alaska because it said you'd be in a helicopter a lot and that sounded cool. And then I applied for a job reporting on hurricane recovery in Lake Charles. And that's where I ended up, and I absolutely loved it. Part of my pitch, I think throughout this conversation, we're going to find a few parallels between where I grew up and where I ended up in Louisiana. But part of my pitch to the paper Flight Adaptation was that I grew up in a place that isn't very dissimilar from South Shoe Camden Territory, working class, cultural community, that also is a bit of a desert. So I felt really dedicated to bringing attention to a place that otherwise you're so always represent. And that's how I ended up in North.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that place that you grew up and a little bit more about those similarities?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, I grew up on an island in the Baltic Sea, in the former East of Germany. So, at a time too that was very sort of tumultuous in the 90s, it's 1992. So, while I was growing up, there was still a lot of rebuilding happening that target the country, transitioning from a planned economy in, the former East to sort of opening up, to a world economy. Where I come from is very, like agriculture is the main driver of the commodity. Lots of fishermen and methods like seafood processing. And then you have a big war that builds ships. And those are pretty much that's what people there do for work, and adjusting that to an economy where they had to compete at a global scale was a very challenging time, with a lot of poverty and a lot of unemployment. So, nowadays, and you'll see some pictures, on the feuds, but I just recently, about a year and a half ago, went back with a friend of mine who took all those pictures. And we went back to the island where I grew up, and it's really beautiful to see how it has, how it's developed since then. There's more sanctuaries now, and there's been a ton of rebuilding. Growing up, there were a lot of empty buildings, a lot of abandoned stuff that was from sort of the old, the old regime or the old that we kind of left behind after reunification. And now it's just usually a ton of like new houses, a lot of them rebuilt in sort of the traditional style with like thatched roofs and stuff. So it's really cool to see. And then to an extent, it kind of reminds me of, Lake Charles after the storm. Like, even when I still worked in hotels, there's still a lot of rebuilding to do, and that's good. But, when I go back now, like every time there's something new, there's a new building, there's a new sort of cultural offering, new restaurant. And so even there, like they're each of them. That.
That's really interesting. And I'm thinking about the thatch roofs. And when I see thatch roofs, I think like, those are so beautiful. And then I think they would never last in the humidity here. But yeah, but they're on the seaside.
Yeah, they take a lot of upkeep, I think. But no, they can last in humidity, but I think they need to. I'm not an expert on thatch roofs, but I know that they take a lot of air.
Well, I was wondering, to go back to what you were talking about earlier about when you first decided to come to California or to do your abroad studies. I mean, I'm imagining, if the wall fell in 1989, you're born in 1992, you're some of the first generation to have, like, to be living in this new place and this new world. And so it was this moment where you can choose a lot of places where you wanted to go. What was it about the opportunity in California? Was it the place of America? Was it, the place of California? Or what was it that was the draw for you? Or where was there a draw?
Yeah. So I had spent some time in the U.S. Before that. I did an internship in New York when I was 19. And I really I was just fascinated by the country. Like, it seemed so different. I remember, like, Germany has a bit of a, I think, reputation of being kind of rigid culturally. And I think that doesn't always apply, but I definitely remember hearing like people's life stories in the US and just being so fascinated at like how many twists and turns they took and ups and downs. And it just, in comparison, especially as a young person, I think I just felt like, Germany felt very prescribed. You're supposed to do things a certain way and not stray too far from that. And I was just hearing these, or hanging out with a bunch of different people like in New York and just hearing these crazy life stories. And I was like, you could never see that back home. Like, you could never. Like, people would be like, why they do this? And like, if things don't work out, they'd be like, well, we told you that they wouldn't work out because of how you did this. So I think that was something that like really fascinated me, like the opportunity to kind of pick a weird path in life and like maybe fail and get back up. I think that was something that really attracted me. And I started studying American studies in Germany. I think always funny to think like that's American studies. It's kind of like English, lit, and poli-sci and all that combined, but with like a focus on the U.S. And when I went to California, I thought it was a really cool opportunity to actually learn more about immigrant communities, because that's something that I felt like they would have a hard time teaching Jewish Berlin at our university. Like, I wanted to take Chicano studies classes and like take African American studies classes, which we covered some of that in school, but I wanted to go somewhere where people with a lived experience could teach me and like provide their perspective on, say, the literature that we're reading and type of media that we're discussing. Out. But yeah, people. Yeah, we'll definitely have a moment where we're talking about other experiences too, because that's a really great part of the table. I also agree with that. So one of the things that another question I had asked, like, European school usually has a reputation for being incredibly theoretical and not very applied. What was the contrast between, studying American studies at a European theoretical place and then coming here and hanging out with people? Yeah, it was a huge difference. And that is in part that is what inspired me to say, if I'm going to go to graduate school, I'm going to do it in the US, because especially me already knowing that I wanted to be a journalist, I was really, really lacking sort of the practical application of what I was learning. It was all very theoretical, and then you write a paper about it and then process that. And like at UCLA, like I got to, in Germany at least, I don't know about other European countries, but we don't have a lot of extracurriculars like at university. You just go to school and everybody does their own thing. Like American campuses and American higher education is a lot more all developing. Like we're really like the school is a community with sort of different opportunities and elements in a way that European education is just not designed that way. And so I was really excited about the opportunity to be part of a student media organization. I got to try out a camera for the first time. I was part of the Daily Berlin video team at UCLA. So I got to learn how to, shoot video for journalistic purposes. And, it just all like, I was part of every club. Like, I was just so excited that there were clubs to be a part of. Photography club, student media, whatever it was. Like, I was always on campus. It was constantly just because we didn't have that back home. And so, yeah, no, I would definitely say that stereotype or that idea of how the true education system holds up. And it's what made me want to come to the U.S. for graduate studies. And I think it's what enabled me to do the work that I do today. I don't think I would have gotten that big.
And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing today, because last we heard from you in the storyline, you were looking at Hurricane Ida and looking at, recovery of Hurricane Ida. And then sounds like you've made an intentional choice after that, that original intentional Mexico City moment of choice when you made a choice to be in Lake Charles, but now you're in Lafayette. What was that choice between the two, or was it a choice?
Yeah, so it was Hurricanes Laura and Delta, but you're good. So that was a grant funded position that the Community Foundation there funded, because the region just wasn't receiving any help and wasn't receiving the same attention that New Orleans or Baton Rouge, normally receive when they're hit by a hurricane. It's kind of, Lake Charles felt kind of left behind despite sort of the devastation that they had suffered. And so the Community Foundation basically, wrote a grant, for that the Advocate ended up, partnering with them on, to have someone report on the ongoing recovery. And the idea was to get more eyes on the story and hopefully sort of get both support from, nonprofits and charitable organizations, but also from the federal government, because 2 years after the storm, they still hadn't gotten it. And they probably still wouldn't have happened if Ida hadn't happened. So, the funding for Lake Charles just kind of shoehorned, or was kind of combined with Ida funding. That's how they were able to get help. But eventually they did. So I would say our project was successful. They did get assistance. And so, eventually the Community Foundation decided that they had sort of achieved what they wanted to achieve with that grant. And, it's time for me to look for a new role. And I really felt incredibly at home in Lake Charles, kind of trained in London that I got there. And so I wanted to stay close to it. So my opportunity could have probably been is that Marie New Orleans or in a Lafayette office. And a big part of that decision was to still be close to Lake Charles and be able to do my book rugby. It was a bit, but I also was really excited about the opportunity of working with the Current. And if any of y'all don't know the Current yet, I really highly advise that check it out. It's a great, grassroots local publication, with a small but very mighty team. And, I had to know the Christian's work before Leslie's work. And, I was just really excited for the opportunity, to kind of learn from them. And it's been really great for me. I feel like there's a few places I want to go, but I think the first one is talking about, what do you feel like do you feel like there's a similarity? There's something happening around. What is this? It's our, that worked. Yay! And we're going to do another print publication sometime in this year. Keep an eye out.
Thank you for sharing that. So thinking about that and thinking about, one thing that you mentioned earlier is you said that Cole is also a news desert. And when I think about the things that are happening here and sometimes in our news desert, do you guys have the same, does your family face very similar things that need to be reported? Or what is it that the news is told that's not getting out, or you should get out further?
So my family does not look that one more, but, so I've kind of, I'm going to be honest, I've kind of lost touch with it, which frankly can be so, and we've had this conversation over the phone, a lot of what I, hear of Germany now, whether it's politics or whatever, it's just WhatsApp groups and memes on Instagram. So I sometimes feel a little bit disconnected from it, at least in a contemporary news way. I'm very connected to my family and friends there, but I think, as we all know, news and especially political news and can take up a lot of space. So you don't really have that much energy and space left at all times to kind of stay in two country purpose. But yeah, I think, especially during the time of transition, I I think there would have been some great opportunities for investigative journalism there that just didn't happen because it's way out in the sticks. So, it's about an hour and a half, 2 hours from Berlin. It's about 2 hours from Hamburg, like the next biggest cities. And I think I think there's probably similar challenges in the sense that when nobody's watching, there's always someone sort of gaining an advantage at the cost of others. And I think that was particularly pronounced after reunification because, there were a lot of people who they had never existed in a capitalist society. They really didn't understand like land rights and what it means to like, especially to sell land or to sell businesses. And I know that there's a lot of people that were taken advantage of. And I think those kinds of dynamics often go undercovered in places like where I'm from or, rural Louisiana because they didn't anyone keep their eye on it. And so it's easy to take advantage. It's an interesting parallel. Thinking about one thing that you said earlier is that it's hard to be in two countries at once, or it's hard to take that space. And so I'm wondering if you could open up or talk to us a little bit about the process of immigration and what's that felt like on a personal level, and then like what's the work look like? So about it's a lot of paperwork, and it's very expensive even if you do it yourself, which I did because immigration and wires are extremely expensive. So I was like, we're just gonna have to figure this one out on our own. It took me. I became a citizen a year ago. So it took me about 7 years to complete that process, and it's very unique for everyone. I think it's hard to say like this is how immigration works or like the legal process works. In my case, like I married a U.S. citizen, and so that's how I got my right to become a green card holder or permanent resident and a citizen myself. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around that process for sure. I think people think you get married and then you're a citizen. It's not quite how it works. I'm living proof of that again, 7 years. Yeah, so that process works kind of similar to applying for or petitioning for a family member. So like if I were to say petition for my mom to come here, which I would like to be able to she refuses, but but you basically, you as the U.S. citizen, you have a right to bring to bring a close member here, and that is someone who's legally married to. In my case, I was already here on a student visa, and so it's kind of like transitioning from that to permanent residence. After a few years, you get to apply for citizenship. Processing times for any of these individual steps differ a lot based on who's the president at the time, what their priorities are. It depends on when you're applying at the time. So these processes, like one step in this process can take like a year, and you're just wait. And so it's a lot of uncertainty along the way. There was a moment where I was getting letters that they were not going to renew my permanent residency, and I had no idea why. And it was about to come up. It was, I think, October, and my green card was running out in December. So I was like, well, I guess I'm just going to have to leave. I have a job here in the apartment. But so it's definitely kind of and I want to point out here that I'm on the very privileged side of it. I wasn't fleeing a country that was unsafe to me. I had a pathway to citizenship by being married to a U.S. citizen. And even for me, it was an incredibly stressful, long, expensive process. So, it's a lot harder and more stressful for people who are sort of coming to it from a more complicated message goes back up.
And that's got to be, that's on top of the work that you're trying to do. And that's also on top of, I imagine, a cultural change or a social change. Could you talk a little bit about what that experience or the personal experience of immigration is
like? I find that people often ask me about culture shock. And I think for me, it's difficult to pinpoint that just because, especially growing up in Germany, in the 90s and early 2000s, I think we were so exposed to US culture already that it didn't really feel that foreign. Maybe we all grew up watching American movies and listening to American music and watching American TV shows and consuming American food. And and I think a lot of people feel that way. The US has been very prolific in sort of spreading its culture across the world. So sometimes I think it's difficult to kind of recognize what you still learn when you move here. I think maybe the biggest difference being sort of what I was talking about earlier, meeting people in real life and hearing their life stories. And of course they don't necessarily line up with what were presented in the media, and kind of defining that broadly. But I think life here is a lot more complicated than I think you learn about when you're just sort of consuming it through media. It's very streamlined. And so, yeah, I guess learning for sort of the nuances of it was probably, that's a process that I'm still in.
Do you have an example of what you mean by a nuance? Or?
I think this diversity in this country is something you don't really truly understand until you see it and you live it. Whether that's people's, ethnic or racial or sort of citizenship backgrounds, the diversity of, social class. I think that and the intersectionality of it, that is just something that you're not exposed to in the same way in most European countries, and especially in Germany. And that's changed to an extent over the past, I would say, 10 years, where we've seen a lot more immigration and a lot more diverse immigration. So I think in Germany, we're not confronting some of the questions that the U.S. has grappled with for a long time. But yeah, I think just the diversity in this country and how all those factors shape people's lives and access to certain resources. I think that's just something that's very unique about the U.S. that speaks our elections about every day.
The complexity, the web of it all is just very difficult to describe. I think we have 3 more questions for you, and then I'm going to open it up for people who may have similar immigrant experiences or that they may want to talk about. But my first question is, how's your mom? How's she doing with all this?
She's great. Every time I can't think of a word while I'm on the phone with her, she's like, "You're coming back. That's it. That's enough. You're forgetting your own language. You have to come back home." I think the last one was blueprint. She remembers these things. But anyways, no, she's great. She's coming here on Wednesday. Honestly, it's tough. I'm very, very close to my mom, so I know that for her it's difficult, but I'm not, I can't just come over for breakfast on Sundays. But at the same time, she's kind of gotten to travel the world with me, and I think that's, she said as much, that's been kind of really cool. There's some, downsides to me being so far away, but at the same time, I think together we've visited places that maybe, she wouldn't have gone on her own. I mean, she comes to visit me once a year. Me on Instagram. But, yeah, I think, politics
seem to have gotten really chaotic across the globe. And sometimes it can feel like it's only here. But then I look back home and I'm like, oh my God, things are really falling apart. So, again, it can be difficult to like exist in two places at the same time. But I definitely see some parallels. And Sam and I were talking, or Cam was my coworker at the Current. We were talking about that yesterday. Just sort of how you see similar political trend, across the world, and that definitely is true for the U.S. and Europe. I think a lot of people are very concerned, especially in Germany, about the rise of the far right, which, given our history, is something to be concerned about. But that's really been happening all over Europe. Which, if anyone is interested in, there's this documentary called On the Way. It's really good. I haven't seen it yet. It covers the organizational efforts behind the rise of the far right across Europe and how it was influenced by sort of U.S. politics. Really good reading. So I recommend that. I think it lays the foundation for understanding a lot of what's happening. But
Well, I appreciate that. Love a good documentary recommendation, especially in documentary weather season. My last question before I open it up is thinking about place. If we look at the cubes, I enjoy looking at the cubes and seeing, like, trying to think about and trying to understand which place was Cameron Parish and which place was Pole, which is a fun little game to play with your neighbor. But there's another thing I wanted to show too is there's a QR tag on that cube. That'll bring you to a 64 Parish Magazine's article about historic German immigration in the United States, particularly in Louisiana, and some of the cultural heritage that's kind of there and late. But for the last question, I wanted to talk a little bit about place. I think you mentioned it before, but the two questions we've asked everyone is, what place is your favorite spot in Louisiana? And then the second is, what is your least favorite spot in Louisiana?
So yeah, one of my favorite places for sure is Cameron Parish, and the story behind these photos. So these photos were taken by my friend who she's from Crowley, and a lot of her family ancestry is some of the German immigrants, rice farmers. Leonard Suzanne Blessler descendant. So I went to the Roberts Combe German Fest with her one year, and we went to the little museum that they have there, and we were looking at the map of where her family is from. And I was like, oh, that's 30 minutes from where my cousin lives. We should go to Germany one day and just go visit and see if we can find, I don't know, any tombstones with y'all family. Because most of them came over here, but it kind of started as a joke, and then we were like, well, should we just go? And so we ended up making a trip to Germany. We didn't make it there. It was kind of out of our way, but we did make it to the island where I grew up. And I had always told people in Lake Charles, I'm like, yeah, I really like it here because it reminds me a lot of home. And Cameron Parish reminds me a lot of home. And they were like, huh? They just couldn't imagine a place that looked like that in Germany. Because I think when people think of Germany, you often think of Heidi and mountains and Oktoberfest, then that couldn't be farther from where I'm from. So when we walked down the little path to the beach in the village where I grew up, she was like, I did it. She's like, yeah, it looks a lot like Southampton. So that that is probably my favorite place because it reminds me a lot of home. What if I tried picking a least favorite place? I find Baton Rouge very alien. And I'm probably not alone with that. I remember driving through Louisiana after I finished my internship in Florida, and my husband at the time and I were driving back to California. So we were on I-10 heading west for 40 hours. And part of that stretch is going through Louisiana, and I just remember thinking kind of an industrial wasteland. That's what it felt like. And it's so crazy to think of that today. And like now I've driven that same route across the Chifalaya through Baton Rouge, across the, like over Lake Pontchartrain to Lawrence, across the I-10 bridge in Lake Charles. Like that landscape is so familiar to me now. And I see so many details in it that I didn't pick up on before. And I see so much beauty in it that I didn't pick up on before. But I remember sort of my first time seeing it. And I think a lot of that was sort of the landscape in Baton Rouge stuff. It's like, what did they do to this place? I think you have a very, at least I agree. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much about yourself and your background with you. Part of this is also making this into a conversation. So I wanted to invite people to think about, do you have an immigration story, or did anything, are you coming from Germany, or did your heritage Germany, and open up the table to see if anyone had a similar experience that they want to talk about. So. In English, and I trained as a German teacher. I studied for years. German is a hard language, Finland. But I don't know. It was my fourth language, and I trained. It's interesting to hear your story because I find my own story within a younger person's story, and I appreciate. I never thought that European invertebrates are very theoretical. I taught her that French. I never thought that it makes a lot of sense. I don't hear those things too much. We are a very few who stayed here, and it was never my plan. I wanted to go back to my happy place in the Pyrenees, where we vacation on the border with Spain. And it even happened because my only child is in Louisiana. And what would I do in Europe? I tried, but it's not fun when there's nobody there. All right. The story I want to share is a bigger story from 1870. My French great-grandfather, my last name is Colin, Colin, and it's now my grandson's birthday. My Armand Colin was a French young man from Alsace, and he had turned German. And in order not to become German and serve in the German army for 6 years, he walked all the way to Belgium doing magic tricks with a big wooden ball on a cord. And my brother asked me last year in October, do you want to take it? And of course I wanted, and I did not, because I was afraid of whatever, dust and mold and things like that, because it was so sensitive in South Louisiana, but it was the same in wet France. And so the story is a story of resilience, because a lot of people from the Gilles Plate area came from Alsace as well. So I am here, and I became a citizen for years after when Belgium recognized dual citizenship, and I did it myself. But it worked because I had been married before to a Cajun man, and what I'm hearing within me is it's impossible to live in two places. Life is where we live. And so, and of course it helps to have Bella. And I thank you for your beautiful story. Now I know who the author in the Current. Now I hear that it's important to keep on reading the Current online and support it, because the press is a voice, and we need to continue that. So thank you, danke, vielen Dank. Thank you so much for sharing that. Does anybody else? Did that bring up anything for someone, or did they want to share too? Okay. But wait. Because in order to survive, that one would have given. Yeah. Hey, stop. Sorry. I don't really know enough to be asking this question, but you mentioned that your town had a not enormous amount of poverty and then globalization, and it's now prospering, if I got some of that correct. But do people in the town, I mean, did that poverty come before globalization, or do people see globalization as part of the reason there was poverty? And do people have any feelings hurt, like, I wish we weren't connected to the rest of the world, or I'm glad we're connected to the rest of the world, that kind of thing. So it's, I guess, less about economy and politics and more about perception is my question. So I'm glad you asked that. I think that's probably one thing that when I talk to Americans about like where I'm from, is most surprising to them, because it doesn't quite match the narrative of reunification from like an American perspective, where like I grew up in a village of 40 people, very, very small, very, like I said, very agricultural. So growing up, most people where I grew up wanted a wall back. They're like, please leave us out of this. Because they were farmers, they were fishermen, they worked at the wharf, and it was a planned economy. So they knew they could always sell their fish, their agricultural products at a certain price. They didn't have to worry about competing in a global market. And that transition was really, really difficult for them. You had these big global companies coming in, you had people buying up land. You talked a little bit about that earlier. So, yeah, I think there definitely was, and I'm not sure to what extent that still is the case, now that it has become more prosperous again. But, and I think in 94, the average unemployment rate in the former East was 40%. So people really struggle to adjust to that new reality, especially in the more rural areas like the one that I grew up in. I think they didn't necessarily have the same perspective on what freedom means as the people in bigger cities. I think, for them, it was just fine how it was. They knew they were able to feed their families. They had a place to live. They had childcare. They had medical health care. They weren't so worried about freedom of speech, honestly, was my impression growing up. Like, that was more something that people in the bigger cities worried about, artists, writers, and I don't want to discount that. But I think to me, it's important for people to understand that the experience of reunification was very different depending on where you were. And some of these areas that were more agricultural, for them, it was not necessarily a positive experience, at least at first. Again, glad to see that it had to become more prosperous. But one of the stories that I'm working on is about premature death. So people dying at a age that's below the average lifespan, and that was inspired by when I lived in Lake Charles. I knew a lot of people who were my age who only had like one parent left at Peepin. And so it really made me wonder, like, why is that? Why are people dying that young? If someone's 30 doesn't, if their parent is already had, then like they must die at a pretty young age. And I saw a very similar trend where I grew up. A lot of the people that raised me are not alive anymore. And they died of absolutely preventable things. A lot of alcoholism, a lot of diabetes, just bad lifestyle choices. And I think a lot of that can be traced back to those like very difficult 10 to 15 years between sort of reunification and the region adjusting to this new reality, and people just really struggling with that. I don't think that's a coincidence. So yeah, it's a very complicated story, I guess. Yeah, thank you. Oh, well, what's up?
It's a cultural thing. This is on a lighter note. Well, maybe it's not a lighter note. It's just more of a simplistic note, I guess. I'm glad to hear that you went to the festival at Roberts Cove. I went to one maybe 15 years ago, but it's very interesting how they keep their culture. Yeah, I think it's amazing how people after, 200 years, maybe almost 200 years, have kept their festival as some of the culture alive. So I'm sure you've read a lot about the different cultures of Louisiana, but like in New Orleans at one time, Germans made up a large percentage of the population. A lot of people don't know that. And they came as business people, and then they came as orators, some in that Crowley area that came for agricultural reason. But at one time in New Orleans, there were many, like over 100 social clubs that were German social clubs. They had their own newspapers. And then, was from what I hear, it was not unusual to hear German spoken. And then with World War I, so people were, I don't want to say forbidden, but very much discouraged. They having plaques or anything on the wall, anything written in German, and that kind of dispersed them from what I've read. I don't know firsthand, but it just kind of did away with newspapers and publications in Germany. And then a lot of that was what we had in World War I, then it came back again in World War II. And there is even some, but I don't know, whatever, it's just that I've read that the beer industry, the brewery industry was kind of headed up with German businesses in New Orleans. And that prohibition really, there's even thought that maybe prohibition came on as a kind of backfire against the Germans. That was kind of like the underlying reason. I'm just saying what I've read. And that so many, the breweries went out of business too. And so the income was going with so many people during that time. So, but anyway, Louisiana has a big German history. And my grandfather came in the late 1800s from Leipzig, not directly here. His family was in Milwaukee first, and then he came to by himself down to New Orleans around, I'd say, 1895. So, and married a lady of French heritage. So, about becoming old stock. And it about one of the things that really intimidated me about being invited to be this is that I was like, I don't feel qualified to speak for like the generalized German immigrant experience. And part of that is that German immigrants don't tend to congregate in the same way that a lot of others in the communities do. And I think there's many reasons for that. But one of the reasons that, for at least up to a theory that book poses, and I think it's a really interesting one, is that Germans were very, very highly motivated to assimilate because of those tensions through 2 world wars. So, anyone interested in learning more of that history, it's a really fascinating book that kind of talks about why the German immigrant experience had been like very unique to the historical forces that were sort of at play there. And because like it's 40% of white Americans out during an ancestry, so it's a huge part of like U.S. history. And yeah, I recommend that book as a teenage. Everything. I'm interested in languages. I really enjoy learning about languages. The original way languages, I shouldn't say original, but like when people first came here, how they spoke, and then of course it's changed with the Americanization. But I was fascinated to hear, we all want to hear about the French here, and how did the Cajuns speak, and how did the Creoles speak. Then I saw a little documentary on the computer a while back about oh Lord, now I can't think of it. The famous
town in Texas that has the big German festival. What in the heck is the name of it? Fredericksburg. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Fredericksburg, someone was doing a video that there were older people there, maybe they're all gone now, that were speaking a German that they don't speak anymore in Germany, but that some people recognize as like, oh, yeah, my great grandfather spoke that. And it was so similar to what, the French, like old words for new things, that kind of thing. And that they had that recorded, some of the way these people were speaking. That was the only place that you would hear that, because it was lost now in Germany. So I always think those things are interesting. Yeah, I never recorded my grandpa speaking. He was from Eastern Prussia, which is now Kaliningrad. So that dialect is very unique. It almost sounds like someone whose native language is Polish speaking German. And so he had a very strong dialect, and I loved it as a kid. I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. And back, like, my parents still grew up around a lot of people who had that dialect, because, after the war, during the war being from Eastern Prussia to mainland Germany. So a lot of people had parents or their friends' parents that spoke in that dialect, and then it just completely disappears. And so that's something I wish I had recorded, because I think it's so cool to like discover these little pockets of history, that by existing like a dialect like that, by existing, brings with it this whole like tale of history, right? Of how spaces and places have changed, Thank you. In your have to interject on that too. Yeah, that's super fascinating, because like the Louisiana Purchase happens. Louisiana Purchase happened 1812, right? I think 1803. Well, that created the land patent system, which made the land that was available in this area up for purchase, which before, because it had been like laundered through enough governments so that they could say that is actually owned by a government and not indigenous communities from there. And so when the land patent system opened up, they were very interested in getting people to occupy that land to kind of give validity to the idea that this land was owned by the United States. And so they wanted people in, but they also wanted to kind of undermine the power of French that was happening in Louisiana. And so that's one of the reasons why they were really targeting German immigrants to come into the area, because they wanted land and they also were not to be cheap. Yeah, it's very clear. Yeah. Or a lot of German immigration to the Americas in general happened. Like there were just like big hosters in every city in Germany are like, under Brazil, we have land. Pretty much like you might just be a poor farmer in Germany, but if you can like get together the money to get on a steamboat to Brazil or to Louisiana or wherever, like you can try your luck here. And like, is that it? I mean, I gotta say this too, but when you say get on a steamboat, the other thing is that Germany really had the ability to do that. When we think about Bremerhaven and like that northern shipping post, and how Hapag-Lloyd, which is a current shipping company, started in northern Germany.
and they were worldwide shipping from, before the 1800s. And so it was natural for people to be able to not only want to come, but have the transportation cheaply available to be able to get. Sorry, I just have to world peace. I mean, oh, yeah, you just move it. It is something that has been kept up at the bar.
Well, I had a question for you. I grew up here, but I moved away for 20 years, and I'm curious about your experience living in a small town and going to these big cities. I went to Los Angeles. I was in California for about 13 years, LA and San Francisco, and I wanted to be in the biggest city possible. But I did feel this pull to come back. And when you were talking about the people that you grew up around and their way of life and how it has remained the same for so long, it reminded me of what it was like growing up here. And I find it interesting that you went to those big cities, but ended up in a small area. And so my question is, do you ever see yourself going back to your roots, or do you feel like you're establishing roots here? And I'm wrestling with that thought myself, just because, I don't know, maybe there's a reason why I'm feeling a pull back to big cities. I love these communities because I feel like they're a great space to be in. But I'd be curious about your experience and what your thoughts are, like, long term.
But, all the time in the year, I think about going back, and I think that's more of a generalized, like going back to church. I don't think I see myself ever using that to what you're at. And yeah, I think I moved to those big cities because when I was a teenager, all I wanted to do. But this is so boring. There's one street off this island and like one bus in the morning and one bus at night. I can't do it. And like all I wanted was, I grew up in a very small, like there were probably more chickens than cattle. And I wanted out. Like I wanted to have like cultural opportunities that we didn't have there. Like I said, there were also, at least in that time, it's like there is like the moment where you realize that like every adult around you is an alcoholic, and it wasn't sobering most of but yeah, it's funny because living here, I've kind of found my way back to my roots in a different way. Like I can totally see myself with the things and like a house full of 4-H and a couple of acres and nesting chickens and cattle. And when I told my mom that, she was like, I cannot believe that. Like you were always this doesn't translate perfectly, but she was like, you were always such a little big city plant. And like now you're like, like kind of come full circle. And so even if I don't necessarily see myself moving back to where I grew up, I think I've come to appreciate that way of life in a different way than I did. And maybe also in contrast, I've had my fill of big cities. I don't know that I ever need to work also city again. But I don't know that, I think that journey needed to happen to that was happen for me to learn to appreciate so I could, even if it's here, and that the similarities, well, thank you. And this is